caught my brother stealing my savings for his new business. When I confronted him, he blamed me for his failures. I was left heartbroken and betrayed by family. So, a couple of weeks ago, I was getting ready for this work event, right? We were all supposed to meet up and have a good time, and honestly, I was looking forward to just getting out of the house for once. Anyway, as I'm putting on my shoes, my husband, well, ex-husband now, Daniel, comes up to me and says, and I'm like, okay, sure, what's up? Thinking it's something normal like a bill or something about the kids. But nah. He goes, I've met someone, I'm leaving just like that. Now, we've been married for 10 years, together for 15, and we've got 2 boys, Owen and Logan, 12 and 11. So this wasn't just some casual breakup, you know? This was the end of our family, our marriage, everything. And the crazy part is, I didn't even feel that heartbroken about it. Like, yeah, I was hurt, but the relief I felt almost overpowered that. I guess I was waiting for this to happen for a long time. We hadn't been happy for a few years now. We were living more like roommates than a married couple, only talking about the kids or what groceries we needed. Honestly, the only time we really acted like we were still married was in the bedroom, and even that had been kind of, well, not great for a while. But still, hearing him actually say it out loud, that he was leaving me for someone else, it hit different. I felt like, okay, so that's it then. I was relieved that at least one of us had the guts to call it quits. But at the same time, I was wondering, why now? Why couldn't we have just, I don't know, tried a little harder? So Daniel's sitting there, explaining how it's all going to go down. He's already found some one-bedroom apartment and says he'll move out until we can figure out what to do with the house, the kids, all that. He's talking like he's got it all planned out, while I'm just sitting there, not saying much, just nodding along. Honestly, it felt like I was floating outside my body, just watching this whole thing unfold like it wasn't even happening to me. You ever feel that? Like this can't be your life. It's too ridiculous to be real. Anyway, once he finishes, I realize I'm already an hour late for the work event. So I grab my phone to order an Uber, not wanting to deal with any more of this nonsense. While I'm waiting outside for my ride, I get a text from Mark, one of my co-workers, asking why I'm so late. Without thinking much of it, I text back something like, oh, Mark, you don't even know the half of it. My husband just dumped me, so I'm free now, haha. But guess what? I didn't send that text to Mark. I sent it to Daniel. Yep. And of course, the second I realized it was too late to take it back. Now you'd think Daniel wouldn't care, right? Like he's leaving me for some younger woman. Why would he give a damn about what I think? But no. That text set him off. He storms out of the house, furious, accusing me of being heartless like I'm the villain here. How can you joke about something like that? He yells. And I'm just standing there like, dude, you literally just told me you're leaving me for someone else. What do you expect me to do? Beg you to stay? I tried explaining that it was just a stupid text, part of this inside joke we've got going at work. I mentioned how a bunch of my coworkers have been splitting up recently, so we've been joking about how our department is cursed like whoever works there is doomed to get divorced. But did he care? Nope. He was too pissed about the fact that I wasn't falling apart the way he probably expected me to. It's like he wanted me to beg or cry or something, but I was just done. And honestly, I think that's what pissed him off the most, that I wasn't falling apart over him leaving. So now, instead of sticking to his grand plan of moving out, Daniel decides he's going to stay. Suddenly, he's not so sure about the divorce. He's going back on everything he just told me, and instead of having a rational conversation like adults, he starts ignoring me, giving me the silent treatment. Anytime I ask him about his plans, like when he's moving out, he just brushes me off or straight up doesn't answer. One day, in one of the few conversations we actually had, he says something about how he was going to be generous with me during the divorce, but now, because of that stupid text, he's going to take me for everything I've got. I'm not even kidding. He really thought that text was some kind of betrayal. I just looked at him and said, you can't take what I don't care about. All I want is my freedom, and that's when he lost it. He slapped me, right across the face. Hard. I never, ever thought he'd do something like that. In all our years together, he'd never laid a hand on me. I was in shock. It wasn't even the pain that got me, though. It was the fact that he did it. Daniel, the man I'd trusted with my life for over a decade. The man who was the father of my kids. And the weirdest part? Later that night, I heard him crying in the bathroom, like he was the one who was hurt. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How do you go from slapping your wife to crying like you're the victim? I'm 42. Daniel's 45. We've got two boys who have no idea what's going on. I moved into the living room because I couldn't stand to sleep next to him after that. But of course, he's acting like I'm the one who's done something wrong. He's refusing to move out, dragging his feet on the divorce. And now he's talking about taking the house, the kids, everything, all because I didn't cry when he told me he was leaving. At this point, I'm just waiting it out. I've already got a lawyer, and I'm documenting everything. I didn't think it would get this bad. But here we are. It's funny how quickly things can spiral when someone's ego gets bruised. So, things went from bad to worse after that whole slap incident. I guess I thought, okay, this is rock bottom. But no, Daniel somehow found a way to make everything even worse. He started acting like I was the one in the wrong. Like he would give me these cold, dead stares when we were in the same room. And any time I tried to bring up the divorce or the kids, he'd just act like I didn't exist. I remember one night I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner, and he comes in, completely ignores me, walks past like I'm invisible. Then out of nowhere he says, I was planning to make this easy on you. I wasn't going to make things difficult. But now, you're going to regret that text for the rest of your life. I just stood there staring at him, trying to figure out if this was real. He's mad about a text? I didn't even cheat on him or anything. It was a dumb joke, and it wasn't even meant for him. But here we are, with him acting like I committed some unforgivable crime. He even had the nerve to tell me he's going to take me for everything. Like our kids, the house, and my peace of mind weren't enough for him. I asked him straight up, "What are you talking about? You're leaving me. You've already moved on." He just smirked and walked away without saying anything else. It was like living with a stranger. No, worse. It was like living with someone who hated you for no reason. Then things got even weirder. One night, Daniel sits me down like he's about to have this heart-to-heart conversation, and I'm thinking, okay, maybe we can actually talk like adults. No. He goes, "I've been thinking maybe we rushed into this whole divorce thing. Maybe we can work it out." Now this came completely out of nowhere. Just a few days before, he was telling me how I'd ruined everything and that I was going to pay for it. Now he's talking about working it out? I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. It felt like he was playing some twisted game with my head. I asked him, "What about Alyssa?" That's the 25-year-old girl he left me for, in case I forgot to mention her earlier. He said, "I'm not sure about her anymore. She's starting to be a little clingy, and she wants kids. I can't have any more kids after the vasectomy." I just sat there trying to process what he was saying. So he's already having problems with his new girl, and now he wants to maybe try to fix things with me, like I'm some backup plan in case his fling doesn't work out? No, I wasn't having it. But of course he keeps pushing. He starts reminiscing about the good times we had, talking about how we got the kids, how we built a life together. And honestly, for a split second I almost thought about it. I almost considered what it would be like to try again. For the kids, for the house, for whatever. But then I snapped back to reality and remembered the slap, the threats, and the way he treated me like garbage just days ago. I told him, "Daniel, we haven't been happy for years. You checked out a long time ago, and so did I. We're just holding on to something that doesn't exist anymore." He just stared at me for a minute, like he couldn't believe I was rejecting him. Then he says, "Fine, I'll move out. But don't expect me to go easy on you in the divorce." And that was the end of that conversation. As if things couldn't get worse, our kids started picking up on the tension. Owen, our oldest, came to me one day and asked if everything was okay. He's 12, but he's smart. He knows something's up, even if we hadn't told him anything yet. I tried my best to reassure him, telling him that sometimes parents just have problems. But it doesn't mean we love him or his brother any less. But Owen wasn't buying it. He asked me, "Is Dad leaving us?" That question hit me like a ton of bricks, because how do you even answer that? I didn't want to lie to him, but I also didn't want to give him the whole truth just yet. So I told him, "Dad's going to be moving out for a while, but you'll still see him. He loves you both very much." Owen just nodded and didn't say anything else. But I could tell he was upset. He walked away, and I just stood there feeling like I'd failed. I'd failed as a wife, and now I felt like I was failing as a mom too. All I wanted was for my boys to be okay. But this whole mess was affecting them more than I realized. Then Logan, our youngest, came up to me later that night, and he was crying. He asked, "Is it my fault? Did I do something wrong? Is that why Dad's leaving?" That just broke me. I sat him down and tried to explain that it wasn't his fault at all, that this had nothing to do with him or Owen. But how do you convince a kid of that when everything around him is falling apart? The next day, Daniel had a full-on meltdown. He comes home from work, slams the door, and starts ranting about how his new relationship with Alyssa is already falling apart. Apparently, she was mad because he wasn't committing fast enough, and she wanted to know if they were going to move in together soon. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This man had just left his wife of 10 years, and now he's surprised that his 25-year-old girlfriend wants more? I told him straight up, this is what happens when you try to live a life you're not ready for. You should have thought about that before you dragged our family through the mud. He didn't like that at all. He started yelling, accusing me of being bitter and jealous. He said that I was the reason his life was falling apart, that if I'd been more understanding, maybe none of this would have happened. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. You're blaming me? You left me, remember? You were the one who wanted out, who found someone new. Now that it's not working out, it's suddenly my fault? He didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he just stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him like a teenager who didn't get his way. And I realized in that moment that I was completely done. There was no going back, no reconciliation, no working it out. This was the end, and honestly, I was okay with it. That night, I made up my mind. I was going to find a new place for me and the boys, and I was going to file for divorce as soon as possible. I didn't care what Daniel did or didn't do anymore. I just needed to protect myself and my kids from his toxic behavior. It was clear he wasn't going to change, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what else he was capable of. So, I started making calls, looking for an apartment, and getting everything in order to finally put this chapter of my life behind me. And honestly, it felt good. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt like I was in control of my own life again. Update 1. So after I made the decision to get out of this mess and start looking for a new place, things got even more complicated, especially with Daniel's behavior becoming more unpredictable. It was like he couldn't decide if he wanted to be the villain or the victim. And honestly, it was exhausting. Every day was a different mood. Some days he acted like I didn't exist, and other days he'd try to guilt-trip me about the divorce, the kids, everything. But let me tell you about the day that really changed everything. One afternoon, I'm picking up the kids from school, and Owen's phone starts buzzing like crazy. At first, I didn't think much of it. He's 12. His friends text him all the time. But then I hear him go, "Why is Dad calling me? He never calls me during the day." Now, that got my attention. Daniel had been pretty distant with the boys ever since all this started, so him suddenly calling during school hours was weird. I tell Owen to answer, and all I hear is this loud, panicked voice on the other end. Daniel's yelling something about how Alyssa had left him, how he didn't know what to do. I couldn't make out everything, but I caught bits and pieces like, "She's gone. And what am I supposed to do now?" Owen just stared at me with wide eyes, completely unsure of how to handle it. So I grabbed the phone and asked Daniel what was going on. Turns out Alyssa had packed up and left him. No warning. No note. Nothing. Just gone. Apparently, she had gotten fed up with him not committing fast enough, and when she realized he wasn't going to move in with her anytime soon, she bailed. Honestly, I wasn't surprised. I mean, what did he expect? She's 25 and clearly wasn't about to wait around for a guy who was still tied up in a messy divorce. But the fact that he called Owen first, that was a new low. Like, why would you drag our kid into this? I told Daniel, "Look, I don't know why you're calling him about this. It's not Owen's responsibility to deal with your relationship problems." He didn't like that, obviously. He just kept going on about how Alyssa was the best thing that happened to him, how he didn't know how to handle it, and how I wouldn't understand. Yeah, I wouldn't understand being left. The irony was wild. After that phone call, Daniel went full victim mode. He started acting all pitiful around the house, moping like a teenager who just got dumped for the first time. But the worst part? He started trying to use the boys to get sympathy from me. I don't know if he thought I'd magically forgive him because he was sad, but it wasn't working. I was done, and nothing was going to change that. One night, after putting the boys to bed, Daniel sat down across from me at the dining table and started with, "I'm really struggling, you know?" I could tell where this was going, but I just let him talk. He went on about how hard things had been since Alyssa left, how he was trying to make sense of everything, And then he hit me with this. Maybe we could try again for the boys. For the boys. Of course, he brought them into it. I couldn't believe it. It was like he forgot everything that had happened between us, like the slap, the threats, the fact that he was the one who decided to leave me in the first place. I stared at him for a second, just trying to process how he thought this was going to work. No, Daniel, I said, we're not getting back together. You made your choice, and we're sticking to it. This isn't about the boys. It's about you trying to fix something that's broken beyond repair. He didn't take that well. He slammed his fist on the table and got up, pacing around the room. So what? You're just going to throw everything away? We got a family, for God's sake. I'm not throwing anything away. You did that when you decided to leave for someone else. I said, trying to keep my voice calm, even though I was boiling inside. This is the consequence of your actions, not mine. He stormed out of the room after that, but the damage was done. I knew he wasn't going to stop trying to manipulate the situation, and I had to protect myself and the boys from his chaos. The breaking point came a few days later. I had been trying to keep everything as normal as possible for the kids. School, dinner, bedtime routines, all that. But Daniel was becoming more erratic by the day. He wasn't showing up for the boys like he used to, always making excuses for why he couldn't take them to soccer practice or help with homework. And when he was around, it was like walking on eggshells. The tension in the house was unbearable. One night, Owen came to me and asked, "Why does Dad seem so mad all the time?" That question broke me. I didn't want my kids to feel the weight of our problems, but it was clear they were noticing everything. I tried to explain it in a way that a 12-year-old could understand, telling him that sometimes grown-ups go through tough times, and it wasn't his fault. But Owen's smart. He knew more than he let on. A couple of days later, Daniel was supposed to pick the boys up from school, but he didn't show. No call, no text, nothing. I ended up leaving work early to grab them, and when I got home, Daniel was just sitting on the couch, staring at the TV like nothing had happened. I asked him why he didn't pick up the kids, and he just shrugged. I lost it. Are you serious, Daniel? You didn't even have the decency to call? The boys were waiting for you. He barely looked up from the TV and said, I forgot. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal. That was it. I couldn't handle it anymore. I realized then that I wasn't just done with the marriage. I was done with him as a person. This wasn't the man I married, and there was no going back from here. That night, after the boys were in bed, I made a decision. I was done waiting for him to figure his life out. I'd already found an apartment, and it was going to be available in a couple of weeks. I didn't care if Daniel tried to make things harder for me. I was going to get out, with or without his cooperation. I started packing the things I needed, slowly at first, just the essentials. I didn't want to tip him off too early, but I knew the moment was coming where I'd have to tell him I was leaving, and I had to be ready. The hardest part was knowing I'd have to break the news to the boys. I didn't want them to feel like I was taking them away from their dad, but staying in that house wasn't healthy for anyone. So I started preparing for that conversation too, trying to figure out how to explain it without making Daniel the bad guy. Even though he was the bad guy in this situation, I didn't want the boys to hate him. They needed to love their dad, even if he was making a mess of everything. But one thing was for sure. I was getting out. I wasn't waiting for another slap, another threat, or another guilt trip. This was the beginning of the end, and I was ready for it. After making the decision to leave and finding a new place, I had a bit of a plan going. But of course, Daniel wasn't making things easy. I knew he'd flip when I told him I was moving out with the kids, but I had no idea just how bad things were going to get. So I waited until the apartment was ready to go before bringing it up. I figured it'd be better to have everything set in stone so he couldn't try and sabotage my plans. I sat him down one evening after the boys had gone to bed. I wanted to make it as civil as possible, like no drama, no yelling, just an adult conversation. But let's be real, that's not how things work with Daniel anymore. I started with Daniel. I found a place. The kids and I are moving out in 2 weeks. Straight to the point. No beating around the bush. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me like I just told him I was taking the kids to Mars or something. Then he stood up, paced around the room a bit, and finally blurted out, "You're not taking my kids away from me." Now mind you, this is the same guy who couldn't even be bothered to pick them up from school half the time. But now, suddenly, they're his kids, and I'm the villain for trying to leave a situation that's been toxic for months. I try to keep calm, though. I told him, "Daniel, I'm not taking them away from you. You'll still see them. But this environment isn't good for any of us anymore. He didn't want to hear it. He started accusing me of brainwashing the boys, turning them against him. And that's when things started getting heated. He was pacing back and forth, raising his voice, throwing every accusation he could think of at me. He even brought up that stupid text again, the one I accidentally sent him instead of Mark. Like, dude, really? We're still on that? At some point, I realized talking to him was like talking to a wall. He wasn't interested in actually having a conversation. He just wanted to make me feel guilty for moving on. So I stopped responding and just let him vent. He stormed out of the house after that, slamming the door behind him. I knew that was just the beginning of what he was going to do next. Over the next few days, things got ugly. Daniel started throwing legal threats at me, saying he was going to fight me for full custody. He even told the boys that I was taking them away from their dad, which of course confused and upset them. I had to sit Owen and Logan down and explain that I wasn't taking them away, that they would still see their dad. But we just couldn't all live together anymore. Owen, being the older one, tried to put on a brave face, but I could tell he was struggling. He asked, "Does Dad hate you now?" And I didn't even know how to answer that. It sure felt like Daniel hated me, but I couldn't tell the boys that. Instead, I told him, "No, your dad and I just have different ideas about what's best for the family right now." It was the best I could do without making it sound like their dad was losing it. Meanwhile, Logan was having a harder time. He's always been more sensitive, and the idea of leaving the only home he's ever known was freaking him out. He asked me, if we move, will Dad come too? That one hit hard. I had to explain again that Dad would still be around, just not living with us. And I could see the confusion on his face. This was the part one dreaded the most, the impact it was having on the kids. 2 weeks later, I finally moved into the new apartment with the boys. It wasn't huge, but it was ours, and that was all that mattered. The first night there, after putting the boys to bed, I sat down in the empty living room and just breathed. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't have to deal with Daniel's constant mood swings or the tension that had been hanging over the house like a storm cloud. It was quiet, and that quiet felt like freedom. Of course, that peace didn't last long. The next morning, I got a call from Daniel. He was completely losing it on the phone, telling me I had ruined everything and that the boys were going to hate me for breaking up the family. I just listened, letting him rant, but what came next caught me off guard. "I'm bringing Alyssa back," he said. "She's going to move in, and the boys will see what a real family looks like." I almost dropped the phone. Alyssa, the girl who left him because he wouldn't commit, was somehow back in the picture now. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the absurdity of it. I told him, "Daniel, you can't just bring someone into the boys' lives like that. They're already going through enough." But he didn't care. In his mind, this was his way of fixing things. He thought that bringing Alyssa back would somehow make him look like the good guy, like he was rebuilding the family, even though it was all a complete mess. I hung up, knowing that this wasn't the last time I'd have to deal with his nonsense. A couple of days later, the boys went to spend the weekend with Daniel, and sure enough, Alyssa was there. When they came back, Owen was quiet, and Logan seemed confused. Owen, being older, understood what was happening, and he didn't like it. He told me, "Dad's trying too hard. He acts like everything's fine, but it's not." Logan, on the other hand, was more innocent about it. He asked, "Is Alyssa going to be our new mom?" That question hit me like a punch to the gut, but I kept my cool. I told him, "No, sweetie. You only have one mom. Alyssa is just Dad's friend." But I knew that wasn't enough. Daniel was pushing Alyssa into their lives way too fast, trying to replace me, and it wasn't fair to the boys. I could see it in their eyes. They were confused, hurt, and unsure of what was happening, and I hated that they were stuck in the middle of all this. The final straw came a few weeks later. Daniel called me, again ranting about something, and then he said, "I'm going to fight you for full custody. The boys deserve to be with me. You're unstable. Unstable." He called me unstable. The man who couldn't keep his relationship with a 25-year-old together, who couldn't pick his kids up from school, and who slapped me during an argument was calling me unstable. That's when I knew I had to fight back. I couldn't let him drag me through the mud and confuse the boys any longer. I called my lawyer that night and told him to prepare for the worst because Daniel was clearly not going to play fair. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting the boys from the chaos their father was creating. And if that meant going to court and fighting tooth and nail, then so be it. I wasn't going to let him mess up their lives just because he couldn't handle his own. That's when everything changed. Update 3. Things got pretty wild after Daniel dropped that I'm going for full custody bomb on me. I knew he wasn't going to make this easy, but I didn't expect him to go that far. It was like everything was a game to him. One minute, he's begging for us to get back together, and the next, he's threatening to take the boys away from me. Honestly, at that point, I was just exhausted, but I couldn't let him win. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about protecting the boys from the mess he was creating. So, I did what I had to do. I lawyered up. I'd already been talking to my lawyer, but now it was time to get serious. I wasn't going to let Daniel spin this situation into some fantasy where he's the perfect dad and I'm the unstable ex-wife. I knew the truth. And more importantly, the boys knew the truth. We filed for a formal custody agreement, and as expected, Daniel didn't take it well. He went ballistic when he got the paperwork. I'll never forget the phone call that followed. He was yelling, accusing me of trying to destroy his relationship with the boys. I just sat there on the other end of the line, letting him ramble on about how unfair I was being, how he was going to make sure I paid for this. It was honestly hard to keep my cool, but I knew I couldn't engage with him. That's what he wanted, a reaction. I calmly told him, Daniel, this isn't about you and me anymore. It's about the kids. They need stability, and that's what I'm fighting for. He hung up on me. Fast forward a few weeks, and we're in court for the first custody hearing. I was a nervous wreck. I knew I had all my ducks in a row. Proof of Daniel's erratic behavior, the missed school pickups, his introduction of Alyssa way too soon. But that didn't stop me from feeling like my entire life was on the line. I remember walking into the courtroom, trying to keep it together for the boys. They weren't there, thankfully, but the idea of them possibly having to choose between their parents weighed heavy on me. Daniel, on the other hand, walked in looking smug as ever, like he really thought he had this in the bag. I couldn't help but feel angry seeing him like that. After everything he'd put us through, he still thought he was in control. The hearing itself was a roller. Okay, it was intense. Both of our lawyers went back and forth, but the real kicker came when Daniel's lawyer tried to paint me as this unstable, bitter ex. He even brought up that damn text message again. The one I accidentally sent to Daniel instead of Mark. They tried to twist it into me being cold and heartless, like I didn't care about the marriage ending. But my lawyer shut that down quick. She brought up the slap, the missed school pickups, and Daniel's emotional manipulation, especially with the boys. She even had texts from Owen that showed how confused and hurt he was by Daniel's behavior. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about what was best for the kids. After hours of back and forth, the judge finally made a decision. And I'll never forget the relief I felt when I heard her say that I would get primary custody of the boys. Daniel would get visitation, but it would be supervised at first, considering everything that had happened. It wasn't a complete win, but it was a huge weight off my shoulders. I could breathe again, knowing that the boys wouldn't be caught in the middle of Daniel's chaos. I wouldn't have to worry about them being used as pawns in his twisted game anymore. Of course, Daniel didn't take the decision well. He stormed out of the courtroom like a toddler having a tantrum, mumbling about how unfair everything was. I didn't even look at him. I didn't need to. I was done giving him any more of my energy, but the drama didn't end there. Later that night, he called me, and at first I thought he was going to scream and yell like usual. But instead, he was crying, full on, sobbing into the phone about how he couldn't believe this was happening, how he never thought things would end like this. I won't lie. There was a small part of me that felt sorry for him. I mean, this was the man I'd spent 15 years of my life with, the father of my kids. But that sympathy didn't last long. He had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. I told him, Daniel, this is what happens when you don't take responsibility for your actions. You're still their dad, but you need to get your life together if you want to be in their lives. He hung up on me again. In the weeks that followed, things started to calm down a bit. The boys were adjusting to our new routine, and I was doing my best to give them a sense of normalcy. Owen was still pretty quiet about everything, but he seemed relieved that the worst was over. Logan, on the other hand, was starting to bounce back to his old self. He'd always been more carefree, and I could see him relaxing now that we weren't living in constant tension. Daniel, surprisingly, started showing up for his supervised visits. I wasn't sure what his angle was at first, whether he was genuinely trying to make things right or if he was just trying to save face. But as time went on, he seemed to be making an effort, at least when it came to the boys. I wasn't ready to forgive him for everything, though. He still had a lot to prove. And to be honest, I didn't trust him enough to let my guard down. I wasn't going to let him drag us back into his mess again. A couple of months after the custody battle, I got a letter from Daniel. It was long, full of apologies, explanations, and promises that he was working on himself. He admitted that he had been wrong about a lot of things, leaving for Alyssa, trying to force a relationship with the boys before they were ready, and most importantly, how he treated me. Reading that letter, I felt a mix of emotions. Part of me was angry that it took him so long to realize what he'd done, but another part of me was relieved. Relieved that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand the damage he'd caused. I didn't respond to the letter. I wasn't ready to open that door again, and honestly, I didn't need to. I had moved on. The boys and I were building a new life, and I wasn't going to let the past drag me down. Now, months later, things are finally starting to feel normal again. The boys are thriving, we've settled into our new routine, and I'm focusing on my future. Daniel is still in the picture, but in a much smaller way. He's trying, I'll give him that, but it's going to take time for him to earn back the trust he lost. As for me, I'm just glad to be free. Free from the chaos, the manipulation, and the constant back and forth. It hasn't been easy, but I'm stronger now, and no matter what happens next, I know that I've got the boys, and we're going to be okay. That's all that really matters.